Thank you very much. It was most informative, and it does add something to gene eating, which has been really as problematic to me as it is to your father, obviously. But I wanted to ask you, you've made it very clear about genes and the processing in the brain when it comes to food. I wanted to ask, in my experience, I've been a type 1 diabetic for 70 years, and I eat roughly the same diet that I was prescribed in 1950. I don't have a problem with dealing with extra food. In fact, I don't have a problem with food at all. And I wonder if in some way or other, some of us are able to counteract entirely the messages that you've adequately prescribed in the nature and the way in which our brains function, our genes function in relation to food wants and so on. And many of the students I talk to who have either diabetes type 2 themselves or have relatives with type 2 just find it so difficult not to eat that second biscuit. And they can't understand why.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Oh, that is so. But that being the point. So you would then be a classic example. You have no problems with food because whatever genetic makeup that you actually have, I think leaving aside your type 1 diabetes, which obviously muddies the water because that is one of the huge hormones that are released that are removed from the system in which you're now putting yourself in a unnatural, keeping yourself alive. But you know what I mean? Okay, it's not pulsing like it's supposed to. But leaving that aside, if you've got no problems with food, you have no problems with food. Whereas it's a very subtle thing where some people do, and there are going to be people who just feel a little bit more driven towards food than you, a little bit less, and therefore they're skinnier and have a six-pack. Whereas there are other people who just cannot help themselves. They cannot help themselves. And the question is why? Now, I am not putting this all on genes. This is the point. This is why I said it was 70%. Clearly, it's not. There's always going to be an issue of culture. There's always going to be an issue of education. In fact, there's always going to be the issue of privilege, in which there is this uncomfortable link between, for example, socioeconomic class and why you have an increased chance of becoming obese. And that's not going to be down to your genes, okay? It's going to be down to your socioeconomic class. And why is that the case? And people will say, oh, that's because the fast food restaurants are next to them. They eat too much. They make bad decisions, okay? Or they don't have the privilege, and privilege comes in three flavors. We have a situation of cash privilege. You have time, okay? I have the same amount of cash, but need 3 shifts. And literacy, not ABC, but what is high in fiber? What is high in iodine? What is high, for example. And I think there is a lack of this. All 3 privileges begin to dip as you go down the socioeconomic class for complex purposes. So I think what you just described there is differing feeding behaviors, different feelings around food, which clearly the environment, including your upbringing and everything, will actually play a role in. And when you mean counteract, do you mean counteract or do you mean that's just who you are? So why is it dangerous to carry too much fat? You've read the book, so you know, okay? Why is it dangerous to carry too much fat? Okay, so there's a fundamental misunderstanding a lot of people make. Where you gain weight, people think you gain fat cells, which is untrue. Okay, what happens when you gain weight? Your fat cells are like balloons. They get bigger and they get smaller when you gain and when you lose weight. People think fat cells are evil. They're not. Okay, your fat cells are the safest place in your whole body to store fat. Okay, so you want your fat cells there. The problem is when the fat's not in the cell. Okay, then it goes to your muscle, it goes to your liver. You may tilt into type 2 diabetes, for example, and all kinds of other nasty things. But what's really interesting here is that people's fat cells can store different amounts of fat. It depends where it is. Do I put it around my belly? Do I put it around my bum? That's well known. But how much can your fat cell expand? And here's the bottom line. All of us have different safe fat-carrying capacities, which is why there are people of different sizes who are ill. Some people can be larger than others and yet be healthier than someone who's skinny. And some, because there's a safe fat-carrying capacity issue. South Asians, East Asians, famously, we can't carry our weight as well. So we have a higher rate, South Asians in particular have a higher rate of diabetes without having to get that big at all. Why? Because they have a lower safe fat-carrying capacity. So that's the other aspect that we have to deal with. Not only the causes of going in this way, but also the causes of where you can put it in that way as well. Also influence whether or not you're going to become ill, and all of that put together.
This is sort of in 2 parts. Do you think that there's a similar genetic component in anorexia? And if there is or there isn't, why is it that anorexia is treated, on the whole, with more sympathy as an illness, and obesity is treated, as you've described, as a sort of sin?
Very good question. So when I first started in the field, all of us were wondering, is anorexia the opposite to obesity? As it turns, now I'm not an anorexia specialist. I just want to put that out as a thing. But what has become clear is it's not the opposite. It's not the opposite. As we now, as far as I understand, someone with an eating disorder, let's go with anorexia, has all of the signals of someone who's starving. So in other words, if you actually take and actually look and everything about them, they can't menstruate if you're a woman because there's no fat. But for whatever reason in their brain, they're able to ignore the signals. So therefore, so whatever the underlying cause, and there is going to be a complex genetic, partly genetic explanation for that, to how they're actually able to ignore those symptoms. Why is it treated more like a disease? I think it's probably more acute. I think you can probably die pretty quickly of anorexia. That is why people give one disease, and they're both, in their own different ways, severe, and both different ways we actually need to set. But no, anorexia does not appear to be the opposite of obesity. It appears to be a situation where they are able to ignore the signals which tell them that they're starving.
I was quite struck by the world map you showed at the beginning with the obesity rates.
Yes.
And it struck me that Japan looked like a bit of an anomaly. It's a very highly developed nation with a low rate of obesity. Is that correct, and why?
It is correct to an extent, although I think the obesity levels are also growing there. The same, for example, in China. I think East Asian people have never, it's probably going to be, clearly it's going to be environment. The Japanese have a very different diet to people in the West. What's interesting, though, is, okay, maybe not specifically Japanese, but I remembered, when I was in Berkeley, when I did my undergraduate. So this is not exactly Japan. I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping. I don't think they all look alike, okay? But because, okay? But my roommate, born, bred in America, this 6'2" tall guy. I said, dude, you don't look like you've been eating Chinese food, right? And then, so I do think that there is a huge environmental influence, but I also do think there is now a rising rate of, because they're Japanese obesity researchers as well, and so I think it's just a situation where, because they're in different time frames, their diets are so different, but it's being increasingly westernized, that this will sadly change. No one's hoping for it to change, but I think that would be the case. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for a really good talk. So you talked a lot about the genetics of why people choose, well, not choose, but tend to eat certain things.
She's taking notes.
Yeah. I was wondering if you controlled the diet between different people with different genetics, whether their basal metabolism could alter their weight independently. So the study has been done. It's the first. So the guy, a chap named Claude Bouchard, he actually housed, I forgot exactly when, he housed a bunch of twins, identical twins, okay, in a kind of like whatever the lab-based scenario, and fed them exactly the same thing, okay? And what he then found for a period of weeks, okay, enough, controlled their diet entirely. And what he found was, unsurprisingly, the identical twin pairs gained exactly the same amount of weight, but when you looked between, remember they've been fed exactly the same thing. When you looked between twin pairs, they gained differing amounts of weight, okay? And so this is not going to be down to food intake, and this is going to be down to something else. And this is the amorphous energy expenditure, maybe physical activity, whatever it is going to be, kind of scenario. So yes, there are going to be genes that are going to be involved in your efficiency, your metabolism. Why have I then spoken about food intake the entire time and not having mentioned metabolism once? And that's because what's interesting, all those genes I showed you, the blue blob, in particular the blue blob, where we know their function, they all influence food intake. And we haven't actually found a lot, if any at all, of genes which influence energy expenditure, okay? The question, or metabolism, the question is why? And I think a couple of reasons. The first of all is that it's easy, when you eat something, it is a physical act. Okay, so I think it's easier to measure when you're eating apple, pizza, donut. Okay, here's something you're eating. Whereas energy expenditure is measured either through heat or through a change in ratio of CO2 to O2 as you breathe it out, which is, as you might imagine, far more difficult to measure at a large scale. Okay, so I think that's problem number one, is that it's easier to measure food intake on a large scale than it is to measure energy expenditure accurately on a large scale, so we're lacking power at the moment, first thing. The second thing, the numbers game. Okay, and I'll give you this particular analogy. Look, if I'm motivated, I can finish a Mars bar in a minute.
okay? And a Mars bar is, or Snickers bar, other chocolate bars are available. It's Mars. It's probably 250 calories, okay? I can eat it in a minute. It will always take me half an hour on a treadmill to burn it off. We, as living creatures, are designed to take in calories much more efficiently than to burn the calories, because that's what's kept us alive. So therefore, whatever change in metabolic rate that we find, and they do exist, all of the genes there exist, will always play a smaller role than the food intake element, which means that not only is the power, are we unpowered at the moment to find huge changes, the changes are going to be smaller. But the genes are going to be there, we just need to improve our technology and our power in order to find them. That's the answer.
Could some of those genes be in the mitochondrial
Yes,
DNA?
yes.
So would you be able to detect those as well?
I would have thought it likely that some of those genes are going to be there. I mean, we know a lot of genes, for example, that play a role in uncoupling, and so therefore releasing heat. People that study brown fat, and they're brown because of loads of mitochondria. So the likelihood is yes, but from large genetic, and people study it, people knock it out in mice, people actually study in flies, okay, for looking at the energy expenditure. And so if you tweak with the mitochondria and various genes, you will change energy expenditure, and this is true. But on a population level, we have not been powered enough. We may not be looking at the right population and not powered enough to find it. But yes, I think that is not unlikely at all.
I'm talking about survival.
Yes.
Which you also mentioned.
Yes.
When you don't take in enough food, so to say, to carry on.
Yeah.
So is there a certain hierarchy in which functions in the body start to shut down? Oh my goodness. And also, sorry, because I'm talking a little bit from own experience, when does your body temperature, when does the body temperature drop in order to survive? Which is a delicate one, I think.
So the second one, I don't know. Okay, in humans, I don't know. I know that, for example, in rodent models and what have you, people, animals that hibernate, you can go into torpor and your body temperature certainly drops. Okay, human beings, as far as I understand, don't do this, but I'm not a temperature expert. So that's the second bit. But clearly, in other mammalian species, this happens. Does it happen in humans? I don't think so, but I'm not sure. The first bit, I don't actually know, and I don't know how hard people have actually studied. I'm sure people have actually studied starvation and which thing shuts off. You can understand that from an ethical perspective, this is difficult to study, okay? From it. Although, I've got this, Brian knows, we've got this crazy Norwegian guy, lovely guy, okay, who managed to convince 12 people, including himself, just to give you an idea, to fast for 7 days, just on water. Okay, and we have the tissue samples and the muscle and the blood biochemistry, and Brian is making smoothies all the time. And I think that will be a good. So I don't think anyone has done it from that perspective, and so that will be a classic study. I don't know if they're starving because they're clearly we can go. With the amount of fat that each of us on average carry, we'd have to go a month without food to die. Look, listen, guys, it's clearly going to be unpleasant. It's going to be unpleasant dying. I appreciate that. But a month without food. So I think the study you're asking is probably quite difficult to do, but this will be a classic example. What happens after a week and actually to measure it? But the answer is I don't know, so it is a very long answer. Yeah.
I wanted to go back to the map for a second, and one of the numbers that struck me in the bottom left-hand corner was how the notional number of obese people has almost quadrupled from kind of 1980 to, I think it was 2014 or 2015. Has your research indicated which of the things we've talked about, which of the drivers, is it genes, is it metabolism, is it environment, has been the primary driver for that change?
Okay, it's going to be environment. Now, which part of the environment? Because our genes haven't changed. So this is so then we go back to the question. Well, if your genes haven't changed, then it's not your genes. So I'll give you this analogy, and then we'll get back to the environment in a second. Imagine, so how have our genes played a role if our genes haven't changed? Imagine if I had a twin, okay, that stood next to me, exactly like me. In one environment, 1970, for example, we would look exactly the same, okay, because we're twins and we stood there and we're doing. In another environment, you come along and push me and you push my twin. Okay, this is a change in environment. Imagine this is 2014 now, but you come along. But you push me, I tense up, and I stay standing up. Whereas unbeknownst to anyone, my twin has a sprained leg, okay? And so when you come along and push him, he collapses. So in one environment, the non-pushing environment, he has a susceptibility in his sprained leg, but because no one is pushing him, we can both stand up, we look exactly the same. But then in another environment, when your diet changes, when suddenly, Uber Eats appears, okay, when you're there, I have a sprained leg. My genetic susceptibility raises its head and I collapse. Okay, so that's the reason why there's an increase, because the change in environment is unmasking genetic susceptibilities. What are the key drivers? There are going to be people studying it, but I think all of them will play a role. Okay, so clearly the kind of work we do is different. So energy expenditure is going to be different. Clearly, the godforsaken mobile phone and Uber Eats is going to, and other things are available, okay, are also going to play a role, and the uncomfortable socioeconomic class. And what happens there is a situation where suddenly, because of the way our food environment, we are now able, the UNICEF Children Malnutrition Report of 2019 has just come out, okay? And in there, they pose a question, which I think is very good. Why have so many children not getting enough of the food they need, okay, and so many getting too much of what they don't need? And I think that is the kind of question we're in. But because what we don't need happens to be cheap, easy to make, highly palatable because they make, and so that is also going to play a role. So there's a very long answer, but that is so the answer. You're very welcome.
Hi. You mentioned a lot about leptin and its control of fat. You didn't mention anything about ghrelin, which I always thought was a kind of balancing counterpoint.
Okay, so I stuck with the fat sensing pathway because we understand the entire pathway a bit better, okay? Now, ghrelin is more complex. So ghrelin, for those of you, so I showed you the food-to-poop tube, okay? And most of the hormones that are secreted from the food-to-poop tube will make you feel fuller. In fact, all of them make you feel fuller, except for ghrelin. So ghrelin is one of the gut hormones, primarily produced from the stomach, a little bit in the upper small intestine, but it makes you feel hungry. And it's been shown, for example, that ghrelin levels tend to spike before they put people in what they call a Las Vegas scenario, okay, where no time cues, okay, but with a big red button. I don't know if it's really a big red button, but imagine it is the scenario. And what they did was they got the people to sit there and to put the big red button when they're hungry. And then they measured all of so they had no time cues, no watch, no nothing, and people pressed the red button at slightly different times, but it's when their ghrelin levels, where were you? There we go. It's when your ghrelin levels peaked. So clearly they play a role in hunger and initiating food intake. There's going to be more complex things which I shan't get into about fat handling because of the moieties that are actually on there and whether or not it actually prepares your body for it. My point is, however, that ghrelin signals to some of the neurons within the leptin-melanocortin pathway as well, one of the natural antagonists for leptin. So ghrelin, not in its entirety, but in part also signals via the leptin-melanocortin pathway in order to, because the MC4 receptor is so critical in moving one way versus the other, ghrelin in part also acts that way, is the answer.
And some of us, when we're hungry, reach out for carbs and others for fat.
Yes.
Is it also a genetic?
I would have thought so. And I think not purely for carbs and purely for fat. So I think there's going to be a genetic influence of the percentage of fat and percentage of carbs that you're going to like. In fact, it's a very interesting thing. It's the mix of the two that most people reach for. So there's carbs, but very rarely do you eat carbs. Well, that's not true. You can have dry bread, I guess, but you have bread and butter, okay? You have pastry. Oh, fat and carbs together. Oh, my Lord. Chocolate. Everything that is good is fat. So the answer is yes, there's going to be genetic influences. We don't know what they are yet, wherever you are. We don't know where they are yet, but they do shift your liking between the percentage of fat versus the percentage of carbs. Exactly what you might like is going to be culturally determined. So Chinese people don't tend to have a lot of dessert, but we will still have the influence about whether we prefer carby stuff or fatty stuff or salty stuff or sweet stuff, for example. That too. Yes, that's gonna play a role, as I showed with the bitterness with the bitterness gene as well.
So a preference for salty food is also.
Okay. I said salty food. I would have thought so. I would have thought that there was going to be a preference for liking tangerines. It's just whether or not we can actually measure food intake to that level of precision to get the power. Remember, we were talking about power to actually find it. There's going to be an genetic influence on all of these different traits. It's just that we haven't found the genes yet because we haven't measured enough people with enough specificity, precision.
Hi. I read about a study being done in the summer of this year, I think in London, where they gave 600 sets of identical twins the same food at the same time of day, and they digested them completely differently, was what I read in terms of impact on the blood sugar level. I know you said in answer to a previous question that metabolism is much less understood, but I wondered if you'd talk to us a little bit about some of the drivers and some of the most important drivers of that.
Oh, okay. Not with any great depth. I mean, you have to then break down the system. There are going to be situations within, I don't know. I mean, one of the key mediators of energy expenditure and metabolism is going to be your thyroid, your thyroid pathway. My dad is a retired thyroidologist. You can ask him later. You know, but there are going to be other genes. For example, the question about whether or not there are going to be genes within your mitochondria, that's also going to be there. There are going to be genes. People study the genes within your brown fat. People study the genes, you know, within, for example, what type of muscle you have, how efficient you are, what kind of muscle you like to build. So I think the answer is, look, I'm not an energy expenditure expert here, and actually we don't know all of the genes that are there, as I said, but they are going to play a role, and I would have thought there's going to be a myriad of different ways that we're going to be able to change our metabolism. Just one thing though, just to clarify something. People think that the skinny people have the higher metabolism, and that's just not true, okay? So the biggest impact on metabolism is your body size. The larger you are, the higher your metabolism. The smaller you are, the lower your metabolism, which people think, yeah, but the smaller person is so wiry, so everything. You got to take it, you got to kind of look at it from a scenario of a mini. Other subcompact cars are available, okay, is always going to, although agile and nippy and everything, is always going to use a lot less fuel than a big SUV. Same kind of thing for that. So yes, but within the SUVs, they have different fuel efficiencies, but broadly speaking, if you're this size, you're going to have a hell of a lot bigger metabolic rate than if you're this size. I don't know if that answered the question, but there we go.
Hi, so I wanted to thank you for a truly excellent and very entertaining talk.
Thank you.
I'd like to make two cultural observations then see whether you think there might be a genetic link. So one is that we live in quite a high-stress society nowadays, and that there is sort of stress eating.
Yes.
But the other is that some people seem to feel stress, and some people seem to be very chill in their day-to-day lives. You can present them with the same scenario, and some people go haywire, and some people just sit there and kind of go, yeah, that's fine, we'll deal with it. So do you think that actually do you think there's a genetic link between how people react to stress and therefore in a high stress society whether they will eat more or less, and whether that's sort of another genetic area?
Undoubtedly is the answer, because we know that there are people who respond to stress by eating, stress eating, whereas there are people, this is not tiger stress, we all respond to tiger stress by running like hell, okay? But this is work stress. Whereas there are some people who respond to stress by not eating. It's all the same hormone, it's cortisol. Yet, we respond in diametrically opposite ways, and there is undoubtedly, it's just that we don't know what they are yet, going to be genes that play a role in why we respond to stress in different ways, and as that stress, undoubtedly, is the answer. We just don't know what they are yet.
Okay, thank you. And I think we'll have to draw proceedings to a close. And I want to pay tribute to the audience for this really excellent discussion. Whenever I speak at RI, I'm always blown away by the quality of the questions and the discussion. But finally, I want to thank Giles for a truly wonderful and charming lecture. This has been incredibly informative, but also incredibly entertaining, and I think is an absolute masterclass in communication and engagement. So thank you, Giles, so much.